Today I'm going to talk about Emma Smith, an elect lady. I want you to first look at the photograph. You'll notice that she is wearing gold beads. When Emma was buried, she was wearing those gold beads. And so that was the look that she preferred. You'd say when she was buried in a green dress with magenta flowers. When you look at the hair of Emma, a woman in the 19th century, she would never cut her hair if she were a Christian because her hair was her crowning glory. But as you look at Emma's hair, you notice that she has ringlets coming down around her face. So what you quickly learn about this portrait of Emma is that when Joseph Smith was in Nauvoo, he had a red brick store. It was one of 38 stores in the town of Nauvoo. And one of the things that Joseph sold was he sold hairs on combs that women who wanted to look cuter would then push the comb into their hair. And so as a result, they never cut their hair, but the combs in the hair represented that they could purchase hair from women who had either one, given up their Christianity or to some other reason they chose to cut their hair. So with that, it is Emma Smith today. She stood about 5'9". Joseph Smith described her as having large bone. She never cut her hair. Her favorite necklace to wear was always what appeared like gold beads. And now we're going to learn something about her life. For Emma, she is born July 10th, 1804, in a place called Harmony, Pennsylvania. Notice Harmony, Pennsylvania was pretty much on the edge of frontier at that time. Also notice the date of her birth. As you look at the date, you quickly realize that Emma was then about a year older than the prophet Joseph, who was born in December 1805. Now, as we look at Emma, we know that she is the third daughter, the seventh child, of Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. A little bit about Isaac. Isaac is adventurous. He and his wife are one of the first to move to a place called Harmony, Pennsylvania. For Isaac Hale, he owns hundreds of acres at a time when it was viewed if a man could own 100 acres, he could live a normal life. He could be a farmer and perhaps not have a second job, such as a school teacher, a blacksmith, or so forth. For Isaac Hale, his job outside of being a farmer was he was a hunter by trade. I don't know how many men listening would like their father-in-laws to be a hunter by trade, but Isaac Hale was. He was such a good shot that for the most part he could hunt on his own acreage. In other words, property that he owned. He was known to occasionally drop off the carcass of a deer or some other wild animal at the doorstep of a widow. Now, you realize any widow that would open their door and see that today, obviously they'd be very nervous. But at that time, if that were to happen, the widow knew that she then had food enough that would get her through the winter months. Now, Isaac, in addition to being a hunter, he was an alderman in the town of Harmony, Pennsylvania, meaning it was like he served on the city council. He was an active member in the Methodist Church. Now, as Emma grew up in his home, you would say for the time period in which she lived, it was comfortable. She was growing up in a fairly well-to-do family. For Emma, she had the benefits of education, which not every woman at that time living in Pennsylvania had that opportunity. For Emma, she had a talent. Her talent was music. She had an amazing soprano voice. As far as an ability with instruments, We have no records of that, but her musical talent is her ability to sing. There are some accounts that perhaps Emma might even have taught school in Harmony, Pennsylvania. Well, as Emma is now growing up and has reached maturity, we turn ourselves to October of 1825. Notice at this point, Emma is now in her 20s, and it will be at this time that she meets the prophet Joseph. Joseph and his father, Joseph Smith Sr., have gone to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and are planning on joining a group that is going to attempt to find some kind of treasure there in that land. Well, no treasure is found, and within a month, Joseph encourages Isaac Hale and others to stop that treasure seeking. What did happen in October of 1825 is that Joseph met Emma. Now, meeting Emma had a great impact on his life. When he returned from that first experience in Harmony, Pennsylvania, which was about 130 miles from his home there in Palmyra, New York, Joseph now is indicating to his mother that he's lonely and that his thoughts are of Emma. Finally, you'd say, Joseph returns to that area, and on January 18th, 1827, he and Emma will elope. Now, this meant there was no wedding with, you'd say, bridesmaids, flower girls, church building. They are being married in a home of a type of justice of the peace. And when Emma's father now learns of her marriage to Joseph Smith, his conclusion was that Emma has been abducted. In other words, she has been kidnapped. And when Joseph and Emma return to her home, his comment is, "You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to her grave." So you can imagine difficult relationships that Joseph had with his father-in-law and perhaps even mother-in-law at this time. Now, to the union of Joseph and Emma will be eventually 11 children. Notice their first child, Alvin, will be born in Harmony, Pennsylvania. Then they had twins. Historians claim the twins' names were Thaddeus and Louisa. The twins will die shortly after their birth. They then adopted twins from Father John Murdoch, Joseph Murdoch Smith, and Julia Murdoch Smith. Of their 5 children, you'd say Joseph Murdoch Smith dies when he's 11 months old and is buried out in Hiram, Ohio. And you'd say of their family then, you'd look and you'd say of their first 5 children, only Julia will live to maturity. Their next children were Joseph Smith III, who lives to maturity. Frederick dies in his 20s. Alexander lives to maturity. Don Carlos Smith dies at 4 years old. Then there is a male child, and David Hiram Smith is born after the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph. So notice for Emma, many of us have had our own sets of difficulties to deal with in life, but for Emma, of 11 children, 9 that she gave birth to and 2 adopted, she had only 5 children who will be raised to maturity. Now, once Joseph and Emma have married, they will then move to Palmyra, New York, as indicated, 130 miles from Harmony, Pennsylvania. They will move into the Joseph Smith Sr. home and live with Joseph Smith Sr., Lucy Mack, and children still in the home. It will be while in that home that Lucy Mack Smith will describe her feelings about her new daughter-in-law, Emma. she described her as charitable, that she was willing to part with anything to literally inconvenience herself to assist others. Now, while living in that home, Emma will have a unique privilege on September 22nd, 1827. About midnight on the 21st, going to the 22nd of 1827, Joseph and Emma will leave the Joseph Smith Senior home and will go to what today we call the Hill Cumorah. As they do so, Emma waits then in the buggy-type wagon while Joseph climbs the hill, communicates with the angel Moroni, and receives the plates. Why is September 22nd, 1827 so significant in the life of Emma Smith? It's because she is the first to know that Joseph Smith has the plates. Now, for Emma, she is very faithful to that trust. In fact, Emma becomes one of the scribes to the Book of Mormon. Notice what she says about that experience. In other words, Joseph dictates, and she writes down his words. She said, "My belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it." She then goes on to say, "I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writings of the manuscript unless he was inspired." Now, for Emma, she does not serve as a scribe long. In fact, after literally about 16 pages, her conclusion is she's got things to do. By this point, Emma and Joseph have moved back to Harmony, Pennsylvania. They have their own home, and she feels like she's got a lot of things to do besides sit down and write. Obviously, Emma and I are not related, but I'm sure impressed with her domestic talents. And so she's got a lot of things to do in the home. And at this point, Joseph will plead with the Lord and ask for someone who can be that scribe. It's interesting, taking the place of Emma will be school teacher Oliver Cowdery. And the relationship between Oliver and Emma is perhaps best shown by who baptizes Emma, a member of the church. So you recall then Emma is a scribe, Martin Harris was the first, then Emma, and now Oliver Cowdery. And it will be Oliver Cowdery, after the Book of Mormon has not only been the dictation is finished, the publication is finished, but who then baptizes Emma, and it will be Oliver Cowdery on June 28, 1830. Now notice a few days after she is baptized, Joseph Smith will receive a revelation for his wife Emma. If you were to look at the entire Doctrine and Covenants, there is only one scripture where the whole section is given to a woman. And so for Emma, it's now called Section 25. And notice it's just a few days after Oliver Cowdery has baptized Emma that Joseph receives this revelation. Now, in the revelation, Emma is told many things. She is to be a comfort to her husband. She is to teach the gospel. She is an elect lady. She is to put together a hymnbook. Well, she has many responsibilities that are now shared with her. We find that Emma will now join Joseph as they move on to Kirtland, Ohio. In Kirtland, Ohio, Emma will live in the homes of these two great men and their families. The one is Isaac Morley, and the other Newell K. Whitney. From there, she will move out to the John Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio, and will eventually leave that Johnson home after her husband, Joseph, is tarred and feathered in March of 1832. Joseph will write a letter to Emma as he escapes after that ordeal, and as he writes her a letter, he will tell her that it is safer and that Emma should now return to Kirtland and to take their only living child, Julia, with her, and to stay with Newell K. Whitney. Now, Emma does that and stays then with the Whitneys. And finally, on December 9th, 1834, she receives a patriarchal blessing. Now, I've had an occasion to read many patriarchal blessings, and perhaps you have too. But in my mind, Emma's blessing really stands out. The reason that it stands out is that there are no ifs in her blessing. Now, I can look at my blessing and think that my patriarch was stuttering as he said, if. But in the case of Emma, there are no ifs, and it ends with a promise, you shall be saved in the kingdom of heaven, even so, amen. So our first patriarch in this dispensation, Joseph Smith Sr., now gives a blessing to Emma with the amazing promise that she will be able to live in the kingdom of heaven, even so, amen. After receiving her patriarchal blessing, Emma now works with W. W. Phelps to put together the first hymnal of the church. There are no musical notes in the hymnal. It's like a series of poetry. But as you look at this first hymnal, many of the hymns that we enjoy today were then sung to various musical renditions, and we can find those in our hymnal today. Well, for Emma, difficult times followed. Not only was she having to bury children along the way, but finally the saints will now move out of Kirtland, Ohio, and by January of 1838, she and her husband have moved to Far West, Missouri. They don't live there long until a man named Lilburn W. Boggs, who is governor of the state of Missouri, issues what is forever called the extermination order against the saints. Now, in this extermination order, among other things, it says, quote, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. This proves to be one of the most difficult times in Emma's life. As she prepares to now leave the state, she stops in to visit her husband, who has been incarcerated in Liberty Jail, with Sidney Rigdon. You've got Hiram Smith, and you've got others. But she now stops in to see him. At this point, a series of letters will go back and forth. For Joseph, knowing that Emma, because of the extermination order, needs to leave the state of Missouri, he will write to her such things as, I would gladly go from here to you barefoot and bareheaded and half naked to see you and think it great pleasure. For Emma, she will be one that will cross the mighty Mississippi River as she makes her exodus from Missouri. And I think it's so interesting as the saints huddle there on the banks trying to decide when to cross the Mississippi and when will the ice stop flowing and the entire river will ice over. For the saints, once the river appeared to be solid ice, they would send their children first, and then the women, and then the men. And in the case of Emma, she is not sending her children. She wants them close by. So notice she's got Julia and Joseph Smith III, and she's got two babies in her arms. And she now crosses the Mississippi. As she does so, the place of her crossing she will end up in what's called the barge town of Quincy, Illinois. Now, Quincy at the time had about 1,600 residents, and they welcomed into their community about 5,500 Latter-day Saints who were fleeing from the extermination order, including Emma. Now, as Emma crossed the river with her children, she was invited to stay in the home of Sarah Cleveland, whose husband was a judge there in Quincy. Now, she will stay in that home until Joseph is able to escape from being incarcerated in Missouri and will join her there in Quincy. From Quincy, the saints, including Joseph and Emma, will actually be the first to move about 43 miles upriver from Quincy to a place called Commerce, Illinois, that we know today as Nauvoo, Illinois. They will move into this house, which has been called the homestead. Now, as they move into the house, Joseph had said, "My house has been a home and a resting place for thousands." Now, there is a story told how W. Phelps, the man that Emma had worked with in putting together the hymn book, W. Phelps comes to Emma and realizing that she's cooking for every Tom, Dick, and Harry that shows up, right? And so he suggests that he's got a plan. And he says, you know what I think you should do? He goes, I think you should have a table like Napoleon Bonaparte had. And Napoleon Bonaparte had a table that seated just one. So if there were two people, there was not enough room for the other person to join in with the food. And so he said this to Emma, and Emma said back to Phelps, she said, "My husband is a bigger man than Napoleon Bonaparte, and that he can never eat a dinner without his friends." And so Emma becomes a real hostess. She becomes the first lady of Nauvoo. But that first summer, on 1839, as they move into that homestead house, they only lived in it for 2 weeks and then spent the rest of the summer out in a tent, as her home was used as a hospital for those that were sick and dying from what they call the strange fever in Nauvoo. Some called it swamp fever, but what they're really suffering from, for the most part, is malaria. And so Emma, what Lucy Mack Smith had seen so long ago, she's willing to part even with her house and live in a tent so others could be cared for. It is no wonder that on March 17, 1842, when Joseph Smith was organizing then the Relief Society, about 20 women now gathered in Joseph Smith's red brick store. They're on the second floor. Their ages are 59 to 18, and among them will be Emma. Once they had concluded the name of the society would be the Relief Society of Nauvoo, Emma was elected the president. For Joseph, it fulfilled, as well as for Emma, Section 25, in which Emma is told that she will be an elect lady. And for sure she was an elect lady on that March 17, 1842 date. She was then given the opportunity to select her counselors. And I always think it's so interesting who she selected. She selected the oldest woman you see there is Elizabeth Whitney. Elizabeth Whitney, Emma had lived in her home. She's the wife of Newell K. Whitney. For Emma, she had seen Elizabeth Whitney and her husband put on a large feast for the poor, the lame, the halt, the blind there in Kirtland. And so she selected Elizabeth. The other woman is Sarah Cleveland, the very woman who had taken in Emma and her 4 children in Quincy. And so right away, you get the idea, what will Relief Society be like? And the answer is, it will be an organization of women who are seeking to be charitable and to do things for others, especially the poor that can't do it for themselves. Now, Relief Society meetings at first were held in Joseph Smith's red brick store. Later, they are held in many places in Nauvoo. It's interesting. The Relief Society, women never taught women in Nauvoo. The Relief Society teachers were men. And if men are going to teach Relief Society, I think they had really good teachers. You had Joseph Smith, John Taylor, and Willard Richards. So Joseph Smith, a prophet of God, John Taylor, Willard Richards, members of the Quorum of the 12. Now, what I find pretty interesting is that there are more of Joseph's speeches preserved to Relief Society than there are speeches when he spoke to the 12, to the 70s. And you'd go, well, why is that? And the answer is the secretary of Relief Society was Eliza R. Snow. And if you were to take Eliza R. Snow's writing, put them on 8.5 by 11 sheets, there's like 1,800 pages, and she is taking notes. How I can always tell that what I'm reading that Joseph said was given at Relief Society is that he speaks on a myriad of topics, but he eventually always says 2 things. The first is, women, bridle your tongues. And I think, oh, my, And the second is, women, provoke your husbands to righteousness. So it's not just provoke your husbands. We all know how to do that. But provoke them to righteousness. In other words, encourage them to be ministers of the gospel and to have served missions and all of those things. Well, after the women were taught in Relief Society, people then gave to Emma what they had for the poor. Now, women back then, they didn't carry purses, but they carried baskets. And they had some kind of handkerchief doily over the top. And when they went to Relief Society, they were always going up, like you go up to Zion. And as they would go up, they would never think of putting anything in their basket they were not willing to give away. So they would then approach Emma or one of her counselors, and they'd have buttons. They'd have 2 pennies, say women were giving pennies to be able to purchase glass for the Nauvoo temple. They had various things, and as so much came forward, Emma was known to say of the Relief Society of Nauvoo, we will do something extraordinary. And then in her 19th century mind, she tried to describe what would be extraordinary. She said, for example, when a steamboat is coming upriver and it gets stuck in the rapids, the women will go out and kind of lift the steamboat up and off the rocks and bring it to shore. Well, those women must have really been buffed. But nevertheless, in her mind, it was something just extraordinary that this society would do. Now, having been a member of the Relief Society for years, truly, it is extraordinary what Relief Society has done in my life, as well as the lives of women and men and those that suffer all over the world. Now, Emma will be president of Relief Society on March 17th, 1842, when she's elected, and she becomes that elect lady. But Emma will stop Relief Society on March 17th, 1844. And some of you will say, but we still go to Relief Society. And I'd say, oh, yeah. It was begun again in Utah in the 1860s. But in Nauvoo, Relief Society lasted for 2 years. Now, once Relief Society ends, the next big time that we look at Emma is on June 24th, 1844. At this point, Joseph has now fled from Nauvoo across the river to Iowa and has made the decision in Iowa that he and Hiram are going west. Messengers have been sent across river to get Orrin Porter Rockwell, and Orrin Porter Rockwell now stops in to see Emma there at the mansion house. As he does so, he now tells Emma that Joseph will not be returning. At this point, Emma writes a letter. And in the letter, she wants him to come back. And she encourages him to come back. When others over in Iowa feel the same as Emma, Joseph will say then and later, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it is none to me. I go like a lamb to the slaughter." Joseph Smith will then go to Carthage. There he will be killed. And as he is, along with his brother Hiram, they are martyrs for the cause of Christ. Word will come back to Emma of Joseph's death. She will learn it from a nephew named Lorenzo Wasson. When Joseph's body is laid out in the mansion house in a kind of makeshift coffin, Emma will come to the door of the parlor, and she will say something like, "I can't do this." She struggles. And then finally she begins to move forward, and she goes, "Oh, Joseph, Joseph, my husband, have they taken you from me at last?" Emma will then sob, and Joseph will ultimately be buried. Time will pass. Months will pass. Emma is pregnant now with her last child, David Hiram Smith, that's born in the fall of 1844, a young baby that will never be held by his father. So what's life like for Emma now after the death of Joseph? She is now a single parent. She is a widow. She has 5 children. The oldest is Julia Murdoch Smith, who is age 13. And her youngest, then born in the fall, David Hiram Smith. The big question is, what is Emma going to do? And she now is, by this point, as she becomes known as Private Emma. Before, you'd seen her out leading the women, even in parades. But now very sequestered and trying to make decisions. When Brigham Young announces that the saints will now flee from Nauvoo, for Emma, she makes no announcement. And the saints try to second-guess her. She stays living in the mansion house. Some of the saints, believing that Emma would not go, instead of leaving their properties to church agents to sell or selling them themselves, will actually go to Carthage and will give their properties to Emma for $1. I'm sure no money passed, but for $1 love and consideration in memory of the prophet Joseph. So you'd say, as one saint after another left, and Emma keeps very private, will she go, will she not go? Emma is now literally amassing a lot of property in Nauvoo. Things look well for her until there's what is called the Battle of Nauvoo in September of 1846. The kind of main place that the enemies want is they want the Nauvoo temple. And whoever controls the temple during what becomes a 3-day battle, obviously they won for the day, and then it rages on the next day. As the battle is going forward, Emma's house, that mansion house, a fire was set to it on the outside. The fire went out, and for Emma, she was confident that the reason the fire went out is that she had saved the Bible translation, and that Joseph had done that revision, and she had all those papers. And so she grabs up those papers, and in the middle of the battle, she announces her property is for sale, and she takes her five children, and she gets on a steamboat, and she goes up to Fulton, Illinois, saying goodbye to Nauvoo forever, or so she supposes. Now, as she goes up there and is there, the mansion house will eventually sell in part to a man named Abram Van Tool. Unfortunately, no money passed. And suddenly, Emma now starts receiving letters from friends, information, saying, are you aware that this man, Abram Van Tool, is taking your furniture and various things, and he's sending them on boats downriver to St. Louis to sell? As Emma now learns what is happening to the mansion house, she says, I have no friends but God, and no place to go but back to Nauvoo. She goes back to Nauvoo. She kicks out this Abram Van Tool, and she opens up her mansion house as a hotel. Now, part of the mansion house during Emma's and Joseph's lifetime had operated as a hotel. But as she opens it as a hotel, hotels back then were different than they are today. Hotels, you had people that were transient, like most of us as we go to hotels. We stay 1 or 2 days and then move on. But you'd say the kind of bread and butter of a hotel was men that were bachelors who wanted to have board and room. In other words, somebody who would clean their environment, someone who would make the food, and they were permanent guests in the hotel or permanent residents. Also permanent residents in a hotel were those needing a rest home. And for whatever reason, they would then move into the hotel where they would have the same advantages of food and clean environment. One of the bachelors, and I use the term loosely, he's been married before, was a man named Louis Bideman. And Louis Bideman now moves into the mansion house. He is the very same age as Emma, having been born in 1804. He lives in the hotel. He and Emma become romantically involved together, and Emma will marry Louis Bideman. Notice the date that she marries him, December 23rd, 1847. So think about it. What do we know about December 23rd? December 23rd, 1805, that's when Joseph was born. So Emma now marries Louis Bideman on December 23rd, 1847. Now, laws were different back then. So by that marriage, we find that Louis now has his name on a lot of those properties that Emma had received from the early saints as they were fleeing west. Well, you'd say they've got a lot of property, and their business is going terrific. The hotel business is big because literally they're saying as far away as St. Louis that the eighth wonder of the world is in Nauvoo. It's not the Nauvoo temple, but it's the stone baptismal font. And so you've got people coming up river all the time to be able to see the font, to see the temple, and they need a place to stay, but where better than the mansion house? And so for Joseph Well, for Lewis then and Emma, everything seems to be going well, but then an arsonist sets fire to the temple. The fire is put out, but then this is followed by a huge wind, and the wind knocks down 3 of the walls there of the temple, and suddenly you'd say, well, what is there to see if we go to Nauvoo? B.H. Roberts described Nauvoo now as the blight. And the temple block, literally, stones were taken, and you can find stones in many houses in Nauvoo today. They're taken from that temple site, and eventually Mulholland Street, a business district on which the temple had literally stood. You just keep going down. Suddenly, you'd say that block now has an Icarian meeting hall, had a shoe factory, a match factory, their apartments, and pretty soon, it was not long before everyone forgot about the baptismal font in the magnificent temple. Well, time now passes. Difficult years follow for Emma as well as Lewis. Lewis and Emma need to be able to pay property tax, much like we pay today. And pretty soon, all this property that they held was going up for sheriff's sale for failure to pay the taxes. Emma will eventually bid Louis Bideman goodbye, as Bideman now heads to California to participate in the gold rush, thinking perhaps that he can make a fortune in the gold rush and return to Nauvoo and be able to save those properties. Unfortunately for Lewis, I don't know whether he made a fortune, but by the time he returns to Nauvoo, he does not have a fortune. He eventually has a immoral relationship with a woman in town. He fathers a child, and that woman and child now move into the mansion house as permanent guests. So you can imagine, not easy for Emma. We now come to 1860. In 1860, on April 6th, there was a meeting of what was now being called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You'd say at that meeting, held in Amboy, Illinois, Joseph Smith III was going, and at that meeting, he will be accepted as their prophet, seer, and revelator of then what was called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was the first vote taken on April 6, 1860. The second vote was, do you accept Emma Hale Smith Bideman as a member of then the reorganization? Now, Emma, notice she was never rebaptized, but she was accepted on her original baptism. Remember way back in 1830 when Oliver Cowdery baptized her? She was accepted then on that baptism. For Emma, she will attend and be highly involved in the olive branch of the reorganization, which met in Joseph Smith's red brick store, that same upper story where she at one point had served as president of the Nauvoo Relief Society. Well, all right, what happened to Emma's children? Such an interesting story. For Julia Murdoch Smith, she had great difficulties as the years came and went. Marriage that failed. Her husband eventually died in a boiler explosion down in Texas. She came back to Nauvoo. She joined the Catholic Church, married a Catholic, and died at age 49, and is buried in the Catholic cemetery in Nauvoo. For Joseph Smith III, for 54 years, he was president of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Frederick dies in his 20s. Alexander becomes an apostle in the reorganization, as does David Hyrum Smith. But David Hyrum Smith eventually spends part of his life in Elgin in an insane asylum and will die there. So if you're looking for heartache, for sure Emma had her share. Emma dies on April 30th, 1879, at age 74. Remember, she's wearing the gold beads. She's got a green dress with magenta flowers and is buried there in Nauvoo, right next to the homestead. Well, in conclusion, I wanted to say a few personal things about Emma. You know, as time has come and gone, I've had great occasions to think about Emma and the hardships that she has faced. I also think that she was married to a prophet of God, Joseph Smith. And I've wondered, would Joseph want to be with her in the next life? I testify that those sealing covenants are true. Emma was sealed to the prophet Joseph. Recall, Emma received her patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr., and in that blessing, there are no ifs. She was promised that she would be in heaven. Even so, amen. So, in conclusion, I am very grateful to Emma Smith. I am grateful to her for many things. I guess being a faithful wife to Joseph, enduring so many hardships, and making it to the end of the row. I am grateful to Emma for being the first president of the Relief Society. That society has blessed me and my family in countless ways. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.